I think it's just going to get weirder and weirder and weirder, and finally it's going to be so weird that people are going to have to talk about how weird it is. Eventually people are going to say, what the hell is going on? It's not enough to say it's nuts. You have to explain why it's so nuts. The invention of artificial life, the cloning of human beings, possible contact with extraterrestrials, the systems which are in place to keep the world sane are utterly inadequate to the forces that have been unleashed.
Welcome back to Forbidden Knowledge News. I'm your host, Chris Matthew. Today my guest is Matt Ehret. Check out my films. Doors of Perception is on Amazon Prime and free on Relay. Occult Louisiana is on Tubi, Roku, Apple, and a few more. We're booking guests for March. If you have any suggestions or you'd like to be a guest, email me forbiddenknowledgenews@gmail.com. Today I want to welcome Matt Ehret. He is a journalist and co-founder of the Rising Tide Foundation. He is also an author and editor-in-chief of Canadian Patriot Review. He is Dean of Political Science at the American University of Moscow and host of Pluralia Dialogos. Matt, welcome. How you doing?
Hey, thanks for having me on. I'm doing okay.
Well, thanks so much for coming on. Today, we're going to get an introduction into your work related to the origins of today's institutions, as well as the techniques of psychological warfare used by ancient mystery cults by maintaining basically a pantheon of false deities and rituals, as well as psychological manipulation, which has evolved into the use of technology, I believe. But you've presented some amazing information about the hidden levels of power. I'm really looking forward to sharing your work with the audience. Before we do, this is your first time on. Tell us a little bit more about yourself and let the audience know how they can find out more.
Yeah, sure. I'm really looking forward to this. And sure enough, if people want to look a little bit more into my background, my work, what I do, I wear a few hats. So they can go to CanadianPatriot.org. It's a little geopolitical historic platform I set up back in 2012. Still maintains daily updates and things like that. And all of my books, my documentaries that I've made with my wife. We started a production studio a few years back, and we've produced about 18 films. And growing. So that's all available, very easy to find. Substack. There's another website called Rising Tide Foundation. And yeah, sure enough, we've been very, very passionate about the idea of trying to figure out what are the historic roots of today's problems. And that's taken us into prolonged investigations, maybe overly prolonged obsessions into mapping out the subtle structures of intelligence, counterintelligence operations, how that overlaps with the occult. And then, as soon as you start going in that place, before you know it, you're seeing patterns that tie the control grid of the ancient world with the medieval ages, with the Crusades, with the the entire 20th century abominations of world wars to the present situation. So it's been a journey, but we're it's a fun voyage in some ways, demoralizing in other ways, but we're doing what we can do.
To start with this conversation, I would ask you if you believe that essentially what we know as things like ufology, the paranormal, even layers of folklore could just be sophisticated psychological manipulation that has essentially evolved with our collective understanding and even technology?
Yeah, I would tend to agree with that characterization. The more I research, the more I've come to get the sense that a lot of the techniques of controlling what we're seeing and controlling the myths, controlling the patterns that shape the imagination, the collective dream, so to speak, that has been wielded by in more recent years that, you and I were already born into a very MI6 CIA managed construct that has been influencing many of the popular books, many of those things that become made into film, into television, even into the comic book realm. A lot of these things are not something simply created for entertainment, but have been constructed with the intention of shaping, you can call it predictive programming, or you can call it something else, but shaping our idea or imagination of what the future is, what human nature is, what the unknowns are that shape and color that which is outside of the boundary conditions, outside of the so-called liminal space, of what our basket of perceptions interprets as being our reality, that we either have to become instruments towards advancing or adapt to or whatever. So that's not I don't think shouldn't be a surprise for a lot of people listening to a show like this, that the CIA has been backing, bankrolling and shaping a lot of the stories in our Hollywood films going back a very long time, or that people like H.G. Wells, who I think was one of the early pioneers of this new technique of or at least its modern expression of this type of mass psychological warfare through his science fiction novels and other things. There's a continuity that these things are there because H.G. Wells was also a highly vetted grand strategist for a system of ancient evil that he was devoted to being a servant of and to maintaining. That was directly part of his participation as a member of the Fabian Society of England that created the London School of Economics, that shaped several generations of economic mercenaries. It all overlaps. I think the problem today is that people tend to compartmentalize things myopically into like, I'm interested in politics. Oh no, but I'm interested in economics. I'm interested in entertainment. I like music. I'm going to look at that, and you can't really do that. They all overlap. And just to say, like, as you were getting across, that this is not new. There's new innovations, but I think when you look at the coloring of how we imagined in the 16th century, in the 17th century, even earlier in the medieval ages, across different parts of Europe, certain stories would be passed down as folk tales that would account for why children would go missing. Pied Pipers. The Pied Piper story was something people find entertaining, but at the same time, there was something to that regarding charming troubadours who would come into town and seduce young people and have them disappear, or at night in different villages in Bohemia, children would periodically go missing in the middle of the night. Women would disappear. You'd hear screams in the forests, and stories of pixies, of fairies would emerge, of elves would come around, of Krampus would come around, the dark, shadow of Santa Claus to punish young children and things like that. Rumpelstiltskin, stories like that, of evil gnomes. So I do think that even though people like Jacques Vallée, a major UFO disclosure advocate, has been around for a long time, helping to set up things like the cybernetics control grid around DARPA that he worked for in the 60s and 70s when he was setting up what became the modern internet. He's been working as an occultist, a Rosicrucian, openly, with various members, promoting this notion that these things being seen in the sky after World War II, typically around military bases, U.S. military and British military bases, we had to interpret as these beings, not just from our own galaxy, but he started saying in the late 60s, he started weaving tales saying that these are kind of like the fairies and the demons and the angels of the ancient world that they didn't know how to put a name to, but they come from interdimensional space. And people like J. Allen Hynek and others started like promoting that same notion. J. Allen Hynek being another major UFO disclosure personality who groomed Steven Spielberg and was even at the foundation of the creation of many of Spielberg's early 1970s, 80s films, like The Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Vallée even played a role in the Close Encounters of the Third Kind as well. They were all part of this Hollywood nexus of initiates that would go and create stories to shape the collective dream. But I think that what they're doing has been something that there's like an element of truth, because Vallée is saying that there's a connection between the type of anal probing, sexual molestation, abuse of human victims that these aliens have been doing from other he says other dimensions, that their technologies can let them leap in and out of other dimensions, which he also alludes to as being like hell, like kind of like Hellraiser, right? And he's like, oh, but there's a connection between that pattern of abuse and the type of abuse that we had recorded from 18th, 19th medieval folk tales of elves and things like that. And there's an element of truth, but I would say in my research that it actually is more likely continuous satanic covens and cults that are organized by high-level warlocks and initiatory priesthoods that have been maintaining a powerful underground, especially within the higher echelons of the noble families of Europe that came to power, especially right before the Crusades were launched, or that reemerged into power positions, even though they had formerly enjoyed nearly unchallenged power for centuries under the Roman Empire, under earlier Babylon. So I think it's the same thing, and they would rather that we think of it as being something a little bit more supernatural than I think it actually is.
Right. What historical era would you cite as being one of the most important as it relates to our modern power structure and the system of governance that we have today, as well as the methods of control, psychological manipulation? What historical era would you say is the most important that led to where we're at right now?
Hmm. It's one of those tough questions, right? Because it's like there's a lot of really important periods that I think shape the contour, the template of what's currently driving us into a certain very bad slaughterhouse. But I would say the Crusades for me is probably the most clear template of what the oligarchy at the upper echelons wishes to recreate, which isn't it's been again very glorified by Ridley Scott, who again is a Gnostic high-level initiate. Ridley Scott's films, as well as people like John Carpenter. But Ridley Scott, he recently did, the what is it, that Crusader movie, the Kingdom of Heaven, with Orlando Bloom. But there's been like a lot of Excalibur, Arthurian legends turned into Hollywood films to romanticize the period of the Crusades. Even Robin Hood, frankly, was probably the head of a witch coven. Which there's an A24 movie actually with what's his name, the guy who plays Wolverine, Hugh Jackman, who's gonna be playing Robin Hood, which I think is probably a more truthful expression of the real Robin Hood, as somebody who was an absolute, like, the story of him and his merry men stealing from the rich, giving to the poor, not true. The actual character seems to have been more like Vlad the Impaler. But that was, again, you have all these things taking place in the context of the Crusades that have romanticized it enormously. But I think when you actually take a sober look at what that whole thing was that went on in a big way from like the end of the 11th century, 1095 was sort of the unleashing of the Crusader policy, all the way up until I would say, it's sort of, it was the end of the 13th century, right before the Templars were taken down, that a kingdom of Jerusalem was maintained in Palestine today. Also, a lot of the northern African region were Crusader states, or Crusader-run regions. But so what was the policy? And I think that throughout the entire 20th century into the present moment, especially since the end of the U.S. Civil War, the older nobility, the higher bloodlines that utilized the power projection capabilities of the British Empire, the Habsburgs. It doesn't just include the British, but it includes sort of an agreement in principle amongst many of the leading families, the various leading noble houses, including of the Habsburg, the Throne on Taxis. You've got the Italian noble houses. They all kind of sometimes will have a rivalry. It's kind of like sharks vying for power positions, but they all kind of agree that their bloodlines are sacred and that they need to work together ultimately to keep the structures of the control grid in place in such a manner that the slave families, which is the vast majority of humanity, remain under I guess you could say, sort of in a cave. If we're going to use Plato's famous allegory, that most people have to remain in a status of cattle, believing that the shadows that they can perceive, known as sense perceptions, are all that reality is, but seeing from the mind's eye, utilizing the higher domain of creative thought, is something only reserved for the the puppet masters who will control the projections of shadows that are cast onto the cave wall of our sense perceptions, and those, the H.G. Wells, the valets will be vetted and will serve the interests of their higher masters. So you got this weird wiring of the system. Now, I'd say when you look at people like Count Coudenhove Kalergi, who shaped so much of the 20th century, he set up the Pan-Europa movement that established what became NATO, the European Union, the entire transformation of the abolishment in the United States of any of its anti-imperial heritage in favor of becoming an Anglo-American sort of monstrosity, which is really what it became, especially after World War II. But if you read his writings, you read the writings of a lot of these characters who are at the top, they really do want to bring back feudalism, which is what, if you look at the Crusades, one thing that made the Crusades possible is just a few decades before the Crusades were launched, what needed to happen first was the destruction of the Anglo-Saxon nobility of England. So that was done through the course of what's called the Norman invasions. So the Norman, which are the Northmen, the Viking, mercenaries. It was basically a pagan structure of ISIS-like warrior caste culture that was used as proxies to get to destroy lands that were not playing along with the blueprint of the higher oligarchs that wanted to reconstitute their own new Babylonian Roman Empire that had formally collapsed a few centuries earlier. So what did they do? They did the Norman invasion. They instituted feudalism. They brought in feudalism for the first time. Before that, there was no feudalism in England. They did the same thing for southern Italy, where there was a Norman invasion of Italy as well, bringing in once again feudalism, which established legally codified human beings as a form of property on the land, a form of cattle to be owned by a lord, a baron. You had things like the Doomsday Book, which is immediately set up by William the Conqueror as a land that a book that parceled out various lands of England, and that established that various selected families that were devoted to his system would be granted these possessions that until Doomsday, until the end of times. Now, once that was in place, these groups also had formally established themselves in France. That's why they came from Normandy in the west coast of France, where they formally used that as their base of operations. So there's this French aspect, this Anglo-French quality to the Northmen. And as soon as that new grid was in place, then the new policy became, let's get forever wars of divide to conquer. So we'll get the Christian world, the Jewish world, and the Muslim world to just go into a forever bloodbath, with the idea of taking this domain of this land where Jesus walked, making that Christian, but in a peculiar kind of Christianity that would then be premised around rebuilding Solomon's temple, and a bunch of chivalric orders, basically knighthoods, would be created to oversee this, of which we know famously the Knights Hospitaller, the Knights of the Holy Sepulchre, which are both still very powerful, and existent. The Knights of the Holy Sepulchre oversees all Catholic, schools, institutions. A lot of money is controlled there. There's 40,000 members, knights and dames in the Middle East, specifically in Palestine, but also in Lebanon and other places. The Knights Hospitaller were created in the same year, 1098. They're today known as the Knights of Malta. There's branches in the Anglican realm of the Knights of St. John of Jerusalem. Pretty much, I'd say nearly every single lieutenant governor of Canada or of the Commonwealth have to be first ordained as Knights of the Order of St. John of Jerusalem before they can be vetted to play their role as expressions of the power of the crown in various parts of the Commonwealth. But the Knights of the Order of Malta has been very big. Pretty much every leading Nazi SS officer was a member of the Order of Malta. Allen Dulles, every CIA director on the other side of the Iron Curtain, was a member of the Order of Malta. It's an initiatory order, and I think on a lower level, like any kind of society like this, there's probably very nice charitable things that most members are not aware of. But at the higher up you go in the echelons, and and the more you start entering the esoteric part of the structure, the more I think the truth comes out of what this actually has been for the last 1,000 years. And the Knights Templar was another one, which was the poor Knights of Solomon's Temple, because their headquarters were, in Mount Moriah, Solomon's Mines, where today you have Al-Aqsa Mosque, one of the holiest sites of the Muslim world that they used as their stables. And these various chivalric orders sort of oversaw massive, not just feudalism, but also child abduction operations. So you had things like the Children's Crusade, which was overseen by the Templars and the Knights of Malta, which saw 40,000 children of Europe just disappear as the kids were told to go on a crusade, because the kids are more pure and the adults are more corrupt. So the kids are more touched by the power of transmitting the messaging of the angels. And you had a few kids who seem to have gone through like proto MK Ultra operations, convinced that they're channelers of Archangel Michael. And you had the prophet, this 10-year-old prophet, Stephen, and another girl like an Ursula, it doesn't matter. But you had these little kids all of a sudden with total conviction, undoubtedly with Templar handlers, convinced the parents of all of Europe to give their kids to this new children's crusade. They never saw any of these kids again. Total disappearance. So the thing was a racket. So, you're creating feudalism, you're creating forever war to keep the nations of the world, instead of working together, keep them divided, keep them fighting. And you have this idea of giving people purpose in life, a purpose to kill and to die for a holy reason. So you have holy sin, the idea of holy murder, and merging the profane and the sacred is a part, I think, also of the new type of acceptable religion and acceptable culture that they want to normalize, where you could think, well, sacrifice is a part of the holy. So whether that means sacrificing of other, if you're doing it for the sake of the holy, then it all of a sudden becomes good. Doing, evil becomes good in some Orwellian backflip of logic in this type of realm. And that was the Crusades in a large measure. And it took it basically brought us into a global dark age. And that was another aspect of it too, is that under the Crusades and feudalism that came with these knighthoods, you had a system of banking. So, modern banking, weaponized banking, emerged out of the Templar control of most of the finance. The Templars controlled most of the royal financial treasuries, even the papacy and the papal banking was all controlled by Templars. And that was at the heart of modern commercial banking and investment banking, or deposit banking, because it was difficult to, travel a treacherous journey. You'd be at risk of having pirates or whatever rob you. So the Templars had control of these new temples and houses where you could just put in your money in one house in France and go to Palestine and pull out the same quantity of cash with a little fee to the Templars. But they controlled a lot of that stuff too. So you had this stuff, which also fed into their operations in Italy, that created many of the things like the Bardi and the Peruzzi banking houses. And a lot of that stuff, when we allowed that type of monstrosity in, bubbles, economic gambling became also a legitimate way, on top of war, of creating fictitious value. And that was one of the ways, by getting people to believe that gambling on the price of what they thought something would be worth in the future was a legitimate form of doing business. All of a sudden you had bubbles created, like what was done in the 1320s, 1330s, 1340s, where massive amounts of money was put into gambling on the price of wool. And when all of a sudden one of the kings, Edward the Third, defaulted on his debts in 1348, that was something that could be done to trigger a controlled demolition of the banking system, which is also what unleashed what became the Dark Age. The massive destruction of like half of the people living in Europe died in a very short time under that trigger. That was not that dissimilar from what was done in the 1920s, when the bank bubbles of the 20s were pricked by the JP Morgan high-level financiers. And they called in their broker call loans. They knew that was going to force a default. That resulted in a chain reaction of other defaults, and the whole system collapsed, where there was death and basically starvation across the streets of America. And in the context of that type of scarcity, of fear, normalized death and murder. As an outcome, people became more malleable, more susceptible to desiring and accepting any form of totalitarian government, including fascism, which is what was being sold to Americans in the 20s. And they were willing to overlook this massive wealth transfer that was already happening. Same thing happened in the 14th century. Same thing is happening now. So I think that a lot of what's going on right now has a lot to do with restoring it, but now with some form of a techno-feudal spin, the same structure of control. And you got Pete Hegseth and others, coming out calling for a new 21st century crusade against Islam and against, China as a new organizing principle to get your desperate slaves to be distracted and to give them a meaning by weaponizing them into becoming tools to kill and be killed in these forever wars with other civilizational states. So that's something that I'm seeing. Also, the Third Temple revival movement, also very loud in the Middle East too, for obvious reasons. So these are all factors I think that have deeper history than people realize.
Yes, and I'd say that also the weaponization of spiritual belief systems, especially Christianity, by the Council of Nicaea. You've also done some great research looking into some of the events surrounding the Council of Nicaea, a lot of lesser known information that I wasn't aware of. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that time period and some of the things that were really unfolding.
Yeah, sure, man. Well, that's a big. It's something that really does require uh, a deep analysis. I've had to look more into this in a serious way through my recent project of writing a trilogy of books called The Revenge of the Mystery Cults. Otherwise, it was sort of on my back burner, on the periphery. I didn't have a clear idea of Nicaea, except that I had a sense that it had a lot of fakery. But I didn't really have a deeper sense. That I think everyone knows that was the council in 325 that consolidated an agreement, a consensus of what would be the acceptable books brought into what became the official Christian Bible. What we see there is sort of the various letters and the organization of a lot of the Old Testament that was brought into the Christian Bible. A lot of that was agreed upon, not all of it, but a lot of it was agreed upon at that council. Other things came in later, right? Like there were other things like the fact that it all ends with the book of Revelation, the so-called letters of the Apostle John. That was actually, I was surprised to discover that was still under big dispute even way after the Council of Nicaea, like into 80, 90 years, even after the Council of Nicaea, they were still disputing, like, do we allow these things into this holy book or not? Like, it's kind of, there's a lot of problematic imagery and speculation. And it seems like it's not even written by this guy, the Apostle John. It seems like it was written like over a century after John had died. And it seemed like there was a pretty high level awareness of that at the time in the 4th, 5th, even 6th century. A lot of the traditions or the behavior of what was expected of holy people who would be employed for the church structure, whether or not priests would be permitted to have a family, or whether they should be expected to be holy celibate. A lot of these things were not even in the Bible. They were sort of done as convention later on after the Council of Nicaea. But the Council of Nicaea itself, okay, so it was called forth by Constantine. And Constantine is a guy who openly, this is not a secret amongst scholars. As I came to discover reading more books, that it was known that he was a follower of Mithra. He was a high-level mystery cultist throughout his entire life. There's some apocryphal story that right on his deathbed, he became a Christian. I don't think that that's ever been true. He was the son of Diocletian, who created these codes that became revived in the feudal Norman takeover of England, which was basically this idea that laws would be passed so that if your father is, you would be, the children would be confined to do whatever their fathers and grandfathers did, so that everybody, it was a high level population control system of codes that prevented anybody from getting outside of an acceptable realm of, if your father was just a janitor, then your great grandkids would be janitors too, right? That was the way to sort of crystallize society. That was part of. So what was going on after the Jesus movement really started, taking hold? Rome had already been sliding into a very dark place even long before that, right? Jesus was born when Rome was already sliding deep into empire. They already got rid of their aspirations of being a republic. That had already happened as soon as Julius Caesar crowned himself the emperor, and then civil wars were unleashed for like 20 years, 25 years of civil war to just mushy up Rome. I'm saying this as context to get at the Council of Nicaea, of course, but it's a roundabout thing. So, Caesar's killed, but then you have Mark Antony, you got Brutus taking faction sides, you got Emperor Octavio Augustus working on kind of with Mark Antony against Brutus, who's leading the killing of, he's leading the conspiracy to kill Caesar. So you've got these terrible wars. Every single sort of high level player has their own little mercenary groups of Roman legionnaires. Now, what's in the context of that, Cicero, who's one of the only sane people who's trying to keep shit together, he ends up getting killed by Mark Antony because he's a troublemaker. He's not playing this left right game that you're supposed to play in the context of a civil war. So he gets killed. He gets his head cut off. At a certain point, Mark Antony and Cleopatra end up dying, and Octavio Augustus, the nephew of Julius Caesar, comes out as the guy. He comes out as the new leader who will reconstitute the world, and the new cult of the Caesars is created. Now, what's often left out of that story is that the mystery cults are shaping everything. So really, the Civil War of Rome is a battle between whether or not this new coming out of a phoenix, an alchemical dissolution of the old republic of Rome, coming out of that phoenixing, dissolve it coagula operation, whether the new seat of power for the world was going to be Alexandria, which is where Mark Antony and Cleopatra had chosen to reconstitute Rome, was Alexandria, and that's where the cult of Isis had its greatest power, and that's what Cleopatra and Mark Antony were devoted to. Or would it be the cult of Mithra, and would it be Rome, which would be the center of the new command, which is where Caesar Augustus preferred to have the center of this new empire? So neither side was good, because the cult of Mithra and the cult of Isis were kind of the same thing in many ways, but with different flavors. One embodied the sort of occult feminine principle, the other one the occult masculine, but they also overlap, right? The cult of Mithra became sort of the more Apollonian cult, which favored a warrior Mithraic knighthood. It was a male-only initiatory system of 7 degrees. Maybe there might be a secret 8th degree. And they worshipped in these Mithraims under the earth, representing the womb of Gaia. That was sort of why all of the Mithraims are located under the earth in these little grottos. There's still like 500 that have been excavated all over Europe, North Africa, the Middle East. There's tons of them. They keep finding more every day. And it's Mithra is the figure with the Phrygian cap, who's a solar deity portrayed usually in his Roman expression as sacrificing a bull and looking over to Apollo or Helios to his upper right-hand corner and away from Venus, a lunar deity, otherwise known sometimes as Dionysius or Bacchanal, Bacchus being the god of revelry and ecstatic states at night. So, whether it's Apollo, Dionysius, or whether it's Venus and Helios, whatever it is, it's the same thing. It's you do your duty, you project an image of being dutiful in the daytime, And at night, you let out your inner beast, and you do an orgy, and you kill somebody while you're having sex with them or something, right?
Yeah.
Again, it gets messed up. But
Yeah.
that's the sort of practice of these initiatory cults. ISIS, not that different in so many ways. But ultimately, it seemed like around at the end of the Civil War, like we're talking 43, 42 BC, there was a deal cut on the Isle of Capri between Caesar Augustus and the high priest of Mithra, that they would go fully with him, or they would go fully with Rome, which is ultimately what happened instead of Alexandria. And coming out of that, there was a new expansionist policy. And Rome, you see the expansionism of Rome now basically fulfilling the ambitions of the earlier Babylon that tried but failed to become, the systematic singular hegemonic control grid that failed centuries and centuries earlier. They tried it again with Persia, it didn't quite work. Now it was with Rome, because again, Mithra comes from Persia. That's sort of the origin of Mithra being brought into Rome, was from Persia and through Anatolia into Rome during this 60 BC period. So every member of the legionnaires, every member of the Praetorian Guard had to be initiated into the cult of Mithra. So you had increasingly the cult of Isis was brought in as Rome became an empire into becoming sanctified as one of the three governing cults. The other one being Attis, Cybele Attis was the third of these three dominant mystery cults that shaped the world as Rome expanded. And one was for men only, but of course there were still some homosexual degrees of initiation. I think the third degree was you had to basically have a male marriage with one of your brethren or something similar that was done with the Templars, as we came to discover later on during the first modern witch trials, which was the Templars, who were doing a lot of the same Mithraic practices in their own coven. And the world was getting really sick. The population had to be made docile of Rome by the games, so like today's Ultimate Fighting Championships, but with more fatalities,
Yeah.
was something much more normalized. And so coming out of this, it was just hell. It was hellish. It was debauchery, and it was kind of like a breath of fresh air that you had all of a sudden this Jesus movement that were breaking away from this pagan system of aesthetics and of behavior, prizing certain things that were fundamentally human and that touched a deep chord, right? And this idea of agapic love, of the power of forgiveness and peace over revenge. All of these things were really part of that thing. But it wasn't just, there's a lot of battles over what was this new thing. It was something that spun out of Judaism. Jesus himself was, people actually today would probably dispute that, but I'm pretty sure Jesus himself was a Jew, and he spun out. That was a spinoff of something else, but it wasn't called Christianity. It was, the Romans thought of it as just another Jewish subcult or something like that, and there wasn't agreed upon codex of what it believed. There were certain letters written by some of Jesus's followers, but that was kind of loosey goosey. So it was highly open to infiltration. That was the problem. Is that when you read a lot of the battle lines of Saint Irenaeus of Lyon, or Clement of Alexandria, or Eusebius, and some of these early church fathers pre and during Nicaea, they're very high quality intellects. Like the level of philosophical depth that they have is mind boggling. Origen as well as another early church father, 2nd century, powerful intellects, often Platonists. But they're dealing with this infiltration of this early Christianity, because a lot of these mystery cults, the cults of Isis, the cults of Mithra, they're spinning off Christianized versions of themselves that are being infused into these early Christian networks that are, again, highly decentralized. Because of that lack of oversight, it's very open for things like the followers of Simon the Magician, who's basically a very evil being who's like one of the saints of the Crowleyite Black Mass Network. There's Simon the Magician, and these figures are professing to be sort of the new messiahs. That they're like, yeah, Jesus is great, we love Jesus, but now there's this new thing that supersedes Jesus, and it becomes basically the Sethian Gospels. A lot of the things that were discovered in the after World War II, around the same time that UFOs began to be observed around military bases, is around the same time that you had the Nag Hammadi scriptures and the Dead Sea Scrolls discovered. And for people listening to your show, I'm using air quotes because I don't think they were discovered. I think they were planted there as part of a new coming out party of the Gnostics. But starting especially in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th century, you had these new Gnostic movements of the followers of Valentinius, the followers of Basilides, the followers of Marcion, all of whom were sort of making new creative writings of the Gospels, of the letters of the various followers of Jesus.
Apostles,
and what they were doing is they were infusing the initiatory rites of initiation of the cults of Isis, of Cybele, of Attis, of Orpheus, of Mithra into a Christian garb, where things like eating of the flesh and the drinking of the blood became a lot less allegorical and a lot more literal. Of like, you had things like what is it? Is Eusebius, or no? It's Saint Irenaeus of Lyon. He documents the ritual of the closing of the flame, where at the end of the ceremonies of the followers of Simon the Magician and Valentinius, which usually involved some sacred prostitutes, you had the shutting off of the flame at the end of the ceremony, where an orgy would break out. Usually in the middle of that orgy, there were ceremonies that involved wrapping like an infant with dough and beating it and then baking it, kind of like ball worship in its own way. That was part of the.
Oh, it's not a party without ball worship.
No, of course, yeah. Yes. Yeah, the vampire ball. So what was that was very problematic, because many Roman people who were not Christians, but they weren't evil either. They were just like good stoic citizens, were horrified by this new kind of Christianity that was emerging, because they were all proclaiming to be the representatives of the authentic Christianity. And so they were like, I do not want this. We need to persecute this thing. And that was part of what was causing a lot of well-meaning pagan Romans to go kind of nuts, as they were seeing actual cannibalism masquerading as Christianity. And they were saying, well, yeah, let's fucking take this shit down. Put more Christians in with the lions, please. And as an excuse, many actual good people who were Christians were getting like picked up and thrown into the lions, and they were just murdering in Colosseums tens of thousands of Christians, putting up on Roman torches to be burnt alive as spectacle. So you could just see how, and maybe there were some lower level, Gnostics who were like disposable too. They fulfilled the role, kind of like some of the lower level witches and witch covens who were like useful at causing fear in the peasants of Europe, but themselves didn't realize how disposable many of them were, so that they were allowed to like burn on a pyre every now and again, even though the people who were often getting burnt were just innocent herbalists and stuff like that. But the same thing was going on. So the Council of Nicaea, it isn't one thing. It isn't all bad and it isn't all good. It's like it's so much more complex than people treat it, as I've come to discover. There's no easy answer, because there were thousands of people who participated at this ecumenical council, thousands. And it was a battle, like hard battle. You had Constantine's followers, and Constantine was a patron of Arius and the Arians, not today's Arianism, but like Arius was a bishop that rejected the Trinity. But also there were other esoteric aspects of Arian's teachings that Constantine, the Mithraic pagan, was actually in favor of, that a certain type of Christianity that was more conducive to being controllable versus other kinds that he didn't like. But the battles were heavy, and they just had to figure out, how do we come up with some sort of agreed upon set of rules of what this thing called Christianity is going to be. And overall, the Nicene Creed, which was sort of the agreed upon manifesto or constitution of Christianity, was like this non-negotiable set of principles. I'm not saying I agree with all of them, but I get pragmatically why they happened, and I get that the best aspects of it is this non-negotiality, or like this agreed upon thing that we all have to believe um that we're made in the image of the divine, of the creator, that Jesus was the expression of the creator on earth, that there's just these certain things that you're like, we're not going to negotiate on these things. And everything else, but it was, again, it was a battle. And I think some deeper serious studies because I've never seen anybody approach this the way I've done just now, and I think more people should, with an appreciation for the battle lines of the mystery cults and of the Gnostic creations, sub-creations of the mystery cults that were in play. And I think if that was done, people would be able to appreciate where were the good guys? Like, what were they doing that were part of the compromises made at Nicaea that generated something that made it more difficult for the Gnostics and for these mystery cults to do whatever they wanted to do. And as such, they failed. And again, the battles of Saint Augustine of Hippo, this North African church leader who I really like. I really respect Augustine. He played a key role at exposing the hypocrisies of the Manichaeans, which was, again, another sort of Zoroastrian Christian esoteric initiatory, very powerful thing that also formed the bedrock of the later Cathars and the Templars centuries later. But that was the Manichaeans. It's still very big today, actually, in esoteric sectors. This belief that there's like forces, demonic, like that there's a balance of evil and good, and that good needs evil to be good, so that you can't have good if you don't do evil. That's basically where you go very quickly if you're a Manichaean. And so, Augustine was nailing that whole thing and destroying a lot of the splintering off efforts of the early fifth century in a city of God to break up Christianity. But he was trying to infuse something. He was trying to amplify the best and get rid of the worst aspects of it. And I think that a lot of what he was trying to do also is premised around looking for what's commonly divine in all people, even if they're Jewish, even if they're Muslim. And he was creating the foundation of a practical diplomatic policy between different civilizational forces that became the foundation of people like Charlemagne in the late 8th century, early 9th century, and his Augustinian advisors who were helping him organize a policy towards collaboration with the Muslim world, with the Muslim Abbasids, that he became very good friends with Harun al-Rashid, the head of the Abbasid dynasty, and they worked together to avoid the crusade, to avoid the first effort to unleash these bloodbaths of crusades, by creating these wonderful alliances around building up educational centers where Muslims and Jews and Christians would work to do astronomy and compose poetry and translate the ancient classics together. The Chinese also were going through a Confucian revival, which saw the Tang dynasty revive the ancient Silk Road corridor that had collapsed in the 2nd century when Rome was also an empire, and the Silk Road basically melted down. But that was being revived, so you had that moving through Asia. The Indian Gupta Renaissance was happening at around that same period, which was resulting in this interesting transmission and sharing of the best of various cultures, from the Muslim to the Christian to the Chinese to the Indian worlds to the Jewish worlds. Khazaria even emerged within that context, and it's very interesting what was going on there in the north, because you had these Renaissance periods, and the ancient families and the mystery cults were always trying to get wars between these different groupings. So, I think the thing that always helped the better strategic creative thinkers to avoid the traps was the best of what came out of the Nicene Creed and the Augustinian sort of revamping of it. And whenever Christianity became the worst expression of itself and became a tool of empire and evil, it was always when the secret mystery teachings of the Gnostics became infused into the papacy, into the various control grids of the chivalric orders and other things that justified the need to do evil to have good. So that seems to be another part of the nuance that I think has to be tightened up a little bit more, and I'm trying to, but it's a lot of work.
No, this is some amazing information. Would you say that as it relates to what we know as our modern secret societies or mystery cults, that they sprung from the time period after the Templars were defeated, essentially being forced underground into these new societies like the Jesuits, the Rosicrucians, Freemasonry, things like that?
Oh yeah. I mean, in terms of their modern incarnation, yeah. Um, Albert Pike was useful. Um, he's evil, but his morals and dogma are useful. As far as like somebody who's really in the occult, like Albert Pike, high level, highly vetted Confederate general, later on goes on to co-found the KKK, the Knights of the Golden Circle, or the Ku Klux Klan, but formerly it was formerly known as the Knights of the Golden Circle. That was their former name before becoming the KKK. And he writes Morals and Dogma when he's revamping the southern jurisdiction of the Scottish Rite. And his Morals and Dogma is like the most useful overview of the history of the arcane and these initiatory rites. And he makes the point in there that the Jesuits are more sophisticated Templars. And he does make, and a lot of people have heard that quote, but to prove it is another thing. It is provable that it is, and I do that in volume 1 of my Revenge of the Mystery Cults. So after the Templars are taken down in 1307 to 1314, 1317 was the really big period where there's a big fight to destroy the hegemony of the Templars, which involved it's one of these things which people have popularly said was caused by just a greedy king, Philip le Bel, Philip the Fourth of France, who was just a jackass and he didn't want to pay his debts to the Templars, and so he burnt them all so that way he could get out of his debts. Garbage. Philip le Bel was a really bright guy, and he had some wonderful advisors like Raymond Lull, who was a former knight but became one of the most important thinkers of the 13th century, and he died in 1315. He was one of the leading advisors of Philip le Bel, who had a policy. He created a policy. He was born in North Africa and was friends with some of the leading Islamic scholars, Ibn Karun. There's so many of these leading Islamic scholars that he was working with, and he was always committed to this idea that we can't stop the Crusades because it's such like a powerful organizing principle of society that he was born into. But he's like, what we can do is we can rebrand it from being something premised around war and bloodbath into something premised around education, which was what Raymond Lull, if you read all of any of his books, he's always focused on this question of how do you use Platonic dialogue in order to find common ground with other cultures who think differently but are all equally made in the image of God, right? So how do we do that? And he had, and a big part of his principle was, okay, we need to study God, the book of nature. We need to study God's creation together in order to learn to find the faculties within ourselves that are truly divine, that we can speak the same language with other religious groups who have a common interest in discovering God's creation and discovering the essence of God and themselves by studying creation. So the study of astronomy, the study of aesthetical, poetry and beauty and architecture were big parts of the Raymond Lull technique, as well as other languages. If you study Arabic, you're going to learn more about the Arabic soul because you're going to read Arabic poetry. You're going to learn more as a Christian. And similarly, if the Arabs are studying various Frank and Italian and European languages, they're going to learn more. They're going to read the writings of Dante. They're going to read the writings of your best, Chaucer and others, and everybody will tune in, so to speak, more with that fundamental humanity. So Philip le Bel was sponsoring Raymond Lull's schools. Raymond Lull was also a major enemy of the Templars and I didn't mention this, but the Templars, we began our chat today around entertainment, political entertainment that serves a political role for shaping the shamanic dream, but also for recruiting people into becoming useful idiots in the play, because it's kind of like a stage play. That's how the Rosicrucians think of things, you know, as a game within a game, a ludibrium, so-called, a big joke. And one of the things that was done was the promotion of these. I mean, troubadours were the means of promulgating these things. They didn't have cinemas, they didn't have record players and things, but they had troubadours who were initiates, usually, not always, but usually, who would go and do perform the tales of Arthurian legends, Grail mysteries, that would be sort of medieval up versions of the ancient Eleusinian mystery plays. So that's something I didn't say earlier, is that all these ancient mystery cults, the thing that united them together is the Eleusinian mysteries. Everybody, whether you're being initiated into Mithra or Cybele Attis or Orpheus or Isis cults, you're expected to do Mecca in Eleusis and go through your Eleusinian deconstruction, death and rebirth of your old self to your new self. That would also involve different types of ritual drugs that would be concoctions and potions that would be used to help disassemble and then reassemble your identity. A lot of this was studied by a lot of the psychiatrists who worked with MK Ultra and Tavistock in the 20th century. By the way, people like Albert Hofmann, who generated LSD-25. He was a student of the Eleusinian mysteries, and he became the dominant world scholar on the Eleusinian mysteries, with G. Gordon Wasson, the guy who promoted, you know, the JP Morgan investment banker, vice president, who promoted basically psilocybins back in the 1950s. He was working with Hoffman for decades, sponsored by the Rockefellers, sponsored by JP Morgan, sponsored by Alan Dulles, in order to revive the thing that had already been there since the ancient times. So that was part of the thing. And part of the thing involved also plays. You had to experience over several days Eleusinian mystery plays that would bring your imagination into a certain type of frequency, into a certain type of tuning that you would meditate upon. You'd think about the stories of the play, your participation in it. And that way, when you got into a psychedelic high, those would be the images that would typically emerge, would be very similar images that would be performed regarding snakes wrapping around your body, you know, on the Leontocephalaus experience of being transformed into a a lion when you're lying naked in a coffin, and a snake would be wrapped around you. So these were elements that were generated within the mystery play. Now, within the Arthurian legends, those were the Eleusinian mystery plays, sponsored by people like Eleanor of Aquitaine, of Mary of Champagne, who were also leading collaborators. And I think of them increasingly, the more I read about these women, as Isis high priestesses of France, who are shaping and training many of the counts, of the dames, of the damsels, and who would be sent from all over Europe into their courts to be trained within the courts of love. And they were, given certain techniques of using, their sexuality, if you're a woman, of other things, to use power over your minions. And they were also sponsoring all of these Arthurian legends to be generated around a remixing of what Arthur was. That had nothing to do with the real Arthur, by the way, who really was a real guy and really does seem quite cool, of the 6th century. But these had nothing to do with that. Lancelot, Guinevere, all that stuff. So, you had these Eleusinian mysteries that were also part of the Templar recruitment thing. This is what Raymond Lull, so that's why I was saying all this, because Raymond Lull has these big polemics against the corrupting influence of the troubadours. But they're organizing to basically take down the Templars. And the Templars were getting, I think, a little bit too big for their bridges. And as Albert Pike had rightfully, I think, criticized the Templars, he said, they wanted to use this vast wealth that they had accumulated to buy the world. But they didn't have the sophistication that they needed to do it. So they fell into some traps that were taken down. That was a bit of a victory. And it did also only work because you had these guys around Raymond Lull and Philip le Bel were able to get their guy in as Pope. They arrested the Templar Pope Boniface VIII, who was the guy protecting the Templars. They actually had to arrest him, put him in a dungeon, he ended up dying, and Philip le Bel got one of his followers to become Clement the Fourth or Clement the Fifth. I forget my popes here, but he became the new pope. They got the papacy out of Rome. They installed it in Avignon, the south of France, as something that was a little bit more out of the control of the mystery cults that had taken control of the Vatican over centuries. So they were able to work with that a lot more. And they had the English king, Edward II, who was the godson of Philip le Bel, who was also working in his own way against the Templars in England. This is all around, 1290s to 1307, 1308. But the Templars didn't disappear after Jacques de Molay and his leading minions were burnt in the world's first major witch trial, because they were whistleblowers that came out and went to the king. They went to the bishops, and they were like, they just couldn't deal with their conscience that had to do these terrible things. And they blew the whistle, and basically Philip le Bel sent out dozens of his own men as agents to go and infiltrate and to see if what was being said was true. They came back and said, "Yep, you gotta piss on the cross. You gotta you gotta kiss the asshole of your initiator. You have to pledge to only have sexual relations with your fellow initiates of the Templars. You got to do these other things. You do have to worship at Baphomet, at the feet of Baphomet." Which later became, I don't think at that time, but it became later on a symbol that was popularized by the followers of Eliphas Levi, as an androgynous, figure, this male, female with a little bit of a snake, goat, and a serpent goat quality to it as well. And basically, they didn't disappear. So even though they were taken down, and that was a victory, a lot of those Templar high-level figures escaped to Scotland. They were reconstituted there under Robert the Bruce. They gave their support to Robert the Bruce, who was able to use their tactics of warfare in his battles against Edward II, which is part of the unfortunate thing with the Scottish independence mythology that came out of his victory over the British, over the English, was that it was made possible by these Templar witches. And at the time, the English that he was fighting were not the evil English empire that later we saw destroy so much of the world. So another grouping of Templars reconstituted themselves in Spain and in Portugal, as well. You had different secret societies set up there, and some merged with the Knights Hospitaller, who were their nominal rivals, but often would work together, and they kind of merged together at that period as well. And coming out of that, you had certain agencies, certain orders that had earlier been created that also became conduits from the Templars. So like you had things like the Franciscans. The Franciscans were set up with the Dominicans to be two sides of the same thing that would run the Inquisitions. And they were co-created around the same time after the Fourth Crusade. The Franciscans being more of the feminine, expression of fealty that would be a little less. Saint Francis of Assisi was a guy who was giving sermons to birds and to cats and to trees, with the idea that they're all God's creation. So there's no qualitative difference between giving a sermon to a human or to a tree or to a dog, because they're all equally made in the image of God, which is a problem that you have right there. Because again, if you could chop down a tree, but you can't chop down a person's head unless you don't make that differentiation that there's something qualitatively different.
Right.
And Dominic de Guzman, who created the Dominican order and was friends with Assisi, there's statues of them holding hands, embracing. He created an order around the dogs of Christ, those who would burn the world to save the world, who would be perfectly obedient Dominicans. But they would work together. One would be more of the masculine, the other the feminine, one the Mithraic, the other the Isis sort of feeling state. But they would both work again together, as often is the case with these left-hand, right-hand operations. Now, the Franciscans also became transformed into, or created the foundation around which Ignatius Loyola would emerge. So his confessor was a Franciscan. He had a number of Franciscan handlers. The Franciscans today celebrate the fact that they merged into. There's lectures from Franciscan monasteries and Jesuit scholars who celebrate the fact that the Franciscans formed the backbone of what became the Jesuits. And the Jesuits were created around the same time. So not to get too much, I mean, I feel like I'm throwing a lot of information, but I'll just wrap it up here, is that the Jesuits were created in 1534. So the same time that the Jesuits were created, and they were created largely or shaped largely in Venice. This is where Ignatius Loyola did his part of this pilgrimage, was in St. Mark's Square in Venice. Venice had a strong alliance with the Templars. Genoa, which was a rival center, a city-state that was a rival to Venice, but was run by a lot of the same oligarchical families. They were more allied to the Hospitallers, Venice Templars. So Venice was the domain where Loyola made his famous pilgrimage and got the heartstrings of one of the leading members of the Venetian royal family, who had an angel visit his bedside in St. Mark's Square, where he had one of his palazzos. And he said, the angel said to him, "How could you sleep so comfortably?" And down went outside in the rain as a holy man. And he went outside and found Loyola cold in the rain, and he brought him in, washed him up. And the next day he brought him to the Doge of Venice. And the Doge was so moved by his story that he bankrolled his journey to Palestine, whereby he then came back and was officially given the rights to create a new order, with some of his colleagues like Francis Xavier and others from the University of Paris, which also forms, by the way, the basis of the X-Men mythos later on, was the Francis Xavier and Albertus Magneto combination of the alchemists and the Jesuit, Apollonian disciplinarians of Xavier, which people could see that played around with by Jack Kirby and Stan Lee in those comic books.
Yeah.
But I'll have to say that's sort of the thing that was created back in 1534, the same time that the Anglican operation was also being created, due to largely, again, Venetian advisors of Henry VIII, which included Oliver Cromwell's great-grandfather, Thomas Cromwell, who was a personal assistant to one of the top Venetian bankers, who was the guy who created the foundations for the Anglican Church, which was another schismatic thing that allowed, it was kind of like an English version of the Jesuits that always worked together, including in the control of Canada. And the Knights of Malta, 1530. So all of these things were happening within a 4-year period. The Order of Malta was created out of the Knights Hospitaller in 1530. So all of these were being done, I think, not as different things, but all different aspects of the same thing that formed the foundations of what then later became the Scottish Rite, which grew out of the Robert the Bruce initiatory degrees of Templarism in Scotland. This is part of the Scottish Rite. Some of this incubated itself for several centuries in France before being brought back into England. This is what became the backbone of the Grand Orient Lodge of France later on in the 17th century, and the Rosicrucians. If you read the writings of Dame Frances Yates, the Rosicrucians. So here's the last thing, because I realized that was another element of what you asked. So the Rosicrucians, in that form, the Order of the Rosy Cross, emerged in 1612 out of there was a Venetian book called something Letters from Parnassus, and it was written by this guy whose name is escaping me, Borondello or something, who was very close to Paolo Sarpi, and he was the bridge between Francis Bacon and Paolo Sarpi. So Paolo Sarpi is sort of this Venetian grand strategist. There's statues all over Venice because he's like the great patriarch philosopher of Venice, who saved Venice against the world, whatever. So Paolo Sarpi, though, is the founder of modern scientific liberalism. So he created a method that enshrined the senses as the only instruments we have to detect truth, is the senses. And he had a whole system in his art of thinking in 1598 that he was writing. So he was becoming one of these high-level grand strategists coming up with a new method of redefining science, of saying that, okay, if we can't destroy science, because the empire would rather just destroy science. They don't like science in its true sense because real science is based upon making discoveries of God's creation, which renders obsolete the old systems of belief and control that had kept us in a control grid. So real science is based on something which is more destabilizing to those who would want total control. But they couldn't destroy it. And if you can't destroy it, the next best thing is to try to co-opt it. And that was part of Sarpi's assignment. And he did a good job, a pretty effective job, of creating a new type of method, which became Baconianism. So him and Francis Bacon, who became Lord Chancellor of England, the advisor of Queen Elizabeth, and then the guy who was also assigned to drive James the First of England crazy. So they were working together. So on the one hand, they're creating the basis of modern empiricism. That's the belief that science should be sense perceptions that are extrapolated into universals. That's not real science, by the way. That's fake. That becomes the backbone of the later Royal Societies of England, of the Isaac Newton project, decades and decades later. But so on the one hand, they're creating this rigid redefinition of science. On the other hand, they're practicing alchemists and occultists. And so the letters of Parnassus, I think it's letter 72 of this Venetian book, becomes the foundation stone of the Fama. So in 1616, you have the first of 3 Rosicrucian manifestos going public, anonymously written, though it's later discovered that one of the authors is a black magician by the name of Valentin André, who's very high up there as an advisor to royal courts, very, very high-level geopolitical strategist. He's a follower of Francis Bacon. He's the author of one of them. So you have the Fama, the Confessio, the year later in 1617. The year after that, 1618, you have the chemical wedding of Christian Rosenkreutz, a fictitious character who, was supposedly born in 1370 and died in 1430 or something. Fictitious character, but it's a construct. And these become the sort of manifestos of the new coming out party of this new order of white hats that were like this noble secret society that had infiltrated the courts of the world, that had promised to usher in a new golden age if they would only do certain things. Now, part of the thing, when you read, my wife, Cynthia Chung, has done an incredible deep dive. She's published a whole series of these studies on the origin of the Rosicrucians. So a lot of what I'm saying, I got from my wife's research as well. When you read the chemical wedding of Christian Rosenkreutz of 1618, it makes a very big point. It's basically it's a chivalric Grail mystery play that this initiate, the first person who's speaking in this book, has received a letter at the end of a quest he's been on, and this letter has told him, "You've been victorious, you've solved all the problems, and now you may come to the party, the celebration, with other people who have also got the special, I've got the golden ticket, you got the golden ticket." And now he's entering into this weird series of rituals that involve watching people being weighed for their nobility, different other people who pass the tests, and you have these banquets, and some of them don't have the nobility that is required of them to move forward, and they have to literally be executed in front of his face. So he watches them, and he documents how he's just eating his chicken, watching these people getting decapitated, and it's just something he's just enjoying the show, and it's kind of horrific what he's being put through as the final initiation with other initiates. But within it, the Order of the Golden Fleece is very important, and as Francis Yates, who's sort of this Warburg Institute scholar assigned to sort of control this narrative that magical thinking causes everything good, that's sort of her assignment. She's a very important scholar. She wrote the Rosicrucian Enlightenment. That's one of her famous books in the early 70s. Very, very useful book. She makes the point that the Order of the Golden Fleece, which is in the chemical wedding, which is at the heart of this whole thing, he becomes an initiate of the Order of the Golden Fleece. That is a real thing. That was set up in 1430 in the courts of Spain, and it's a Habsburg, sort of the nominal Habsburgs, are at the heart of this chivalric order. Again, 1430. And the Order of the Golden Fleece was set up in 1348. And as Francis Yates makes the point, the Rosicrucians are the Order of the Golden Fleece. And sure enough, who was creating the Order of the Golden Fleece? The Order of the Garter. Sorry, not the Golden. The Order of the Garter. Who was setting that up in 1348? It was Edward III, the guy who unleashes the Black Plague, who sets off the banking collapse in 1348. That's the guy who unleashes the 100 Years' War, which is sort of like a Phoenix alchemical bloodbath of that destroys so many lives, like half the population. It's the death is unimaginable of English and French, but it spreads even to other countries. A lot of it's focused on England, though. This is England and France. This is the guy who's creating the Order of the Garter. And the Order of the Garter today exists as the highest chivalric order of England. And the Order of the Fleece is the Austro-Hungarian, also with the Spanish branch of the Habsburg family that oversees the Order of the Golden Fleece. They work together. And part of what Edward III is doing when he's creating the Order of the Garter is he brings all of the feudal Norman barons, the knights and sub-knights of England together for several days of mystery plays. That's part of the official historic records. And he creates the Round Table. He loves the mystery plays, the Arthurian legends so much that he creates his Order of the Round Table. There's jousting, there's other weird things going on. Apparently evening orgies. He's apparently also a witch, according to Gerald Gardner, who's the disciple of Aleister Crowley and the founder of modern Wicca. Gardner had written in the 50s and 60s a number of works on the historic currents of witchcraft, and he makes the point, and I think he's correct, that Edward III is a witch, and when he sets up the Order of the Garter, it's got 26 members. That Gardner makes the point that's two witch covens of 13 with a head witch at the top of both. And there's a whole story around the Garter as well as being one of the signs of adherence to witchcraft, which Edward III was a part of. It seems also on the historic record that his father, Edward II, who was the son of Philip le Bel, who helped take down the Templars, was himself murdered by witches, that there was a hex, a collective hex organized, a curse, in 1325 against the life of Edward II. And the way these things work, it's usually he's just killed, and then all of the useful idiots who are part of these witch covens are then led to believe that they did it and the spirits were abiding by their will, because the person that they did the hex on goes and wakes up dead, and they're like, oh, look, we did it. So that's just a confirmation bias that's been used to maintain this type of thing for a long time. Yeah. So yeah, this is what literally translates into the Rosicrucians become the backbone, and they make the point that this is in one of their manifestos, and I think it's the chemical wedding, but it might be the Fama. They say that they will wait for 100 years to emerge in a new form to advance their golden age. Now, keep in mind, whenever they promise a golden age, they always promise golden ages. It always results in a stupid set of idiots who believe it to do things that result in a bloodbath of multi-generational war, whether it's the 30 Years' War, which was the direct outcome of the three Rosicrucian manifestos that was burst onto the scene in 1620, or whether it was the 100 Years' War, that was the consequence also of useful idiot Edward III Witch, who then unleashes his golden age, which is actually just 100 Years of War, or whether it's the Crusades earlier on, which was promised to be a golden age. As soon as we take the kingdom of Jerusalem and rebuild Solomon's temple, we'll have a golden age for all mankind after we've... No, it doesn't work that way. It's always the opposite effect, which is the intention. And so that is what forms the basis of the modern Freemasonry that emerges in 1712 in England first, and then sort of branches out, with the Scottish Rite soon following suit at the early 1800s. Actually, it was already incubating in a different form in the 1700s. And the Grand Orient in the early 1700s was an outgrowth of that. So yeah, you you can map this out. Again, my wife's ongoing work on her Substack and my New Babylon, Mystery Babylon and the Age of Aquarius book also kind of goes into some of that mapping. And the last thing I'll just say too is the Benedictine monasteries. The Benedictine order is everywhere in this thing. That was like that was the first modern order set up in the 1525 period, or sorry, not 525 period, by a Roman patrician who went through again an ecstatic revelatory experience inside of a cave, which is always what they do, whether it's Loyola or whether it's Francis or whatever. You got to go into a cave, isolate yourself with a sensory deprivation kind of therapy, maybe with some other, handlers giving you certain things in your bread, like ergot, whatever. And you start seeing lights and angels and shit. And you come out thinking after a period of a few months or years in the cave that you're the Messiah and you can create a new order you're touched. And that's sort of the Benedictines become sort of one of the top cults controllers that are seeding these different agencies, which is where, if you look at the Templars, they're created by a Benedictine Grand Master, Bernard de Clairvaux, who creates and runs the Cistercians. These are radical Benedictines. Or you look at Gerard de Sasso, who's the founder of the Knights Hospitaller, they're just everywhere, these Benedictines. So I'd say that that's another aspect of the story too.
This is such great information, man. We'll definitely have to do this again because there's so much that I'd like to get to. But to close out, I'd like to get your thoughts on how these mystery cults have continued to weaponize modern folklore, ufology, through groups like the Theosophists, the Invisible College, and basically infiltrating what we know as modern ufology to create this new UFO religion, essentially.
Yeah, man, that's a big one. That's going to be the topic of our new episode 5 movie, actually. So we've done the hidden hand behind UFOs. So we've done 4 episodes. 1, 2, 3. So 4 is on Roswell and the birth of a new legend. Episode 5 is going to be on the Theosophists and Aleister Crowley. This will also bring in things like L. Ron Hubbard and Jack Parsons from the Crowley's OTO Lodge in California, which you can't really zero in on that question without looking at the Crowleyites. Crowley created the foundations. Actually, he designed in 1918 or 17 during World War I. He actually designed the template of what became the Greys, or what became used as the model for the Gray aliens throughout the next 100 years. That's the figure of Lam, Lam, this demon that presented itself in one of his magical workings. Mm-hmm. And his followers, Jack Parsons again, L. Ron Hubbard, took it to the next level, especially L. Ron. After World War II was done. So the thing about all of these guys, including Crowley, is that they're part of something that exploded onto the scene in a big way a little bit after the U.S. Civil War. The U.S. Civil War is a big moment because that was supposed to go in a different direction completely. That was the thing Albert Pike was overseeing as far as this Order of the Golden Circle. It was kind of like a chivalric. I mean, if you look at what the Order of the Golden Circle was a secret paramilitary society of occultists who were ordained or believed that they would not just create a schismed USA and undo the US Constitution, but once that was accomplished, their idea was to create an empire centered in Cuba, which would be the seat of this new island empire that would expand the system of slavery. And you could even see the maps that still exist today from what they were doing back in the 1850s as a planning that would involve taking Mexico, all of the Caribbeans, most of South America, and creating this empire that would grow and grow, expanding the principle of slavery ever more fully, with a special relationship with Great Britain, which he always saw as being the masters of the show. The United Grand Lodge of England was the control center of his Scottish Rite. And that was supposed to be victorious. But, again, cooler heads who were much smarter than many of the politicians we have today were able to sort of avoid falling into these traps of of left versus right dichotomizations that had also the northern branch of the Scottish Rite organized around agents of, I mean, if the Scottish Rite had a northern and a southern branch, right? And the northern branch also was devoted to the United Empire Grand Lodge. They also were all in favor of erasing the Constitution, basically creating a new nation, a new Northern Confederacy that would have a special relationship with England. The Southern branch would have their own special relationship, and increasingly, that would be the foundation around which the new Roman Empire would be sort of rebirthed. Lincoln and company didn't fall for those traps. They had a different strategy. So the oligarchy, once the Civil War went in a way they didn't like, they had to get more creative. And so one of the things they did is they immediately created in 1875 the Theosophists around a Russian mystic, the granddaughter of the leader of the Rite of Strict Observance and the Martinists of Russia, which was Madame Blavatsky's grandfather. That's how she was introduced to the writings of Eliphas Levi as well, and Edward Bulwer Lytton. So she actually was a disciple of Lytton and Levi, as was Colonel Olcott and getting my name to my Quan Judge. So you have this new movement set up as sort of the spiritual warfare branch of the British Empire that was designed to overthrow conventional Christianity, conventional morality, conventional ideas of the virtue of having families and following your conscience. Get rid of all of that and create a new revival of the mystery cults. And so her Isis Unveiled was sort of the Isis coming out party in 1879 or 1878 was her first manifesto. Part of that idea was that you have these transcendental ascended beings, these enlightened ascended masters of the Great White Lodge that she was portraying, kind of the same thing as what the Rosicrucians were portraying as these enlightened masters running this white hat campaign of the early 17th century, promising, the cleansing of the world and a new age would emerge was part of that promise. And you had, a Manichaean counterpoint in this grand cosmic space opera of Blavatsky, that you had the Great Black Lodge of the Jews and the Jesuits, who also had mystical powers, but they had demonic spirit forces that were on the evil side, whereas we had demonic spirit forces of the white hats who were on the good side, working in this cosmic battleground. And only a few of the enlightened elites had the power of transmitting, of channeling the messengers, the hidden messengers of Saint Germain and Master Moria and Kutumai and all of these characters that she just kind of created out of. She created a bunch of and within the Theosophists, it's kind of a hodgepodge of taking the different elements of different religious, the most superstitious aspects of different religious orders of the world, and kind of like creating a composite stew of we'll take a little bit of Zoroastrianism here, we'll take a little bit of esoteric Buddhism here, we'll take some of the Bond stuff here, we'll take a little bit of the esoteric Christianity and some of the Sufi Islam here that we like, and they just create a new thing, Most of it was plagiarized. Like Blavatsky was renowned for just stealing other people's material and calling it her own. And anyway, that's proven. She's also proven stage magician. She was found culpable and she was caught just making up using stage magic in order to make it appear like letters were being transmuted into her physical reality, written by the ascended masters who were giving her instructions on how her followers should obey her in ADR India, where they set up their headquarters, and sure enough, every single when you will allow this kind of shit into the world, these kinds of groups always get schismatic, because at some point you're going to have some other dude, whether it's an Annie Besant or a Charles Leadbeater or whatever, all of a sudden say, well, actually, the Master Moria was speaking to me last night, and he actually said that we should do this other thing. And you create these battles, these absurd egotistical battles between different high priests who go and say, well, all right, you're not listening to me. I'm going to create my own theosophical lodge, and it's going to the masters will say these different things, and you get these appearances of disputes, but it's just an appearance. In essence, they totally agree on the same cosmology, and that sort of creates the foundation of the belief that there are these. Lost my signal here, came out of my focus. Whatever, I'm blurry now. That's okay.
That's all right.
But this image, this story that you have these beings on Venus, that they're located on Venus, or maybe they're located on Mars, or maybe they're located on Uranus, and they're the rings of Saturn, and that's where these disembodied entities who are the precursors of Hyperborea, which seeded mankind in the first of these root races. That's where they're located, and they're colonizing the Earth that way, and have been overseeing the collective evolution of the species through these different mass exterminations that in the theosophical doctrines, you always have these several root races as they move from one to the other, always has to be punctuated by these mass exterminations of the unfit, because they're all eugenicists. They all kind of want to create arguments that necessitate that we accept these purgative periods of massive death, these Kali Yuga ages of anarchy and death, in order to have purgative violence, in order to usher in the new ages that they promise are going to come about. So that if we believe that, we will do nothing to stop it. That's part of their thing. And increasingly, the type of vast, that imaginative cosmological space that Blavatsky and her followers created, because they keep on every generation adding more detail. It created an intellectual fertile ground to start creating sub-stories and dramas that people like Leadbeater gave more. Charles Leadbeater, the prolific pedophile who worked with Blavatsky, Annie Besant, to usher in the New World teacher religion, right, with Krishnamurti. In his works in around the same time that Crowley was writing, and Crowley was also part of the same Hermetic Order, the Golden Dawn Rosicrucian network that was working with Blavatsky during the 19th century. That's where the Hermetic Order kind of spins right out of, with their Isis Urania temple, which is sort of how they came out. Just like Blavatsky came out with Isis Unveiled, a few years later, the Hermetic Order comes out with their Isis Urania Lodge. So it's all about this Isis coming out thing. Leadbeater is just adding more detail to these ascended masters as living on other planets more directly. Blavatsky only kind of got at it from Venus, but he becomes the basis of the Venusians. If you look at a lot of the characters, like who's that guy who runs the fascist silver shirt movement in America? Pelly, William Dudley Pelly. He's running the order, the Grand Order of Tibet Theosophical Lodge in the 1920s and 30s in California, and then he goes on after the big UFO coming out party in 1946-47. He creates he creates one of the most powerful UFO cults of that period. He's also a fascist. He's promoting, Nazism and the protocols of Zion in America too. He's getting sponsored by the J.P. Morgan Rockefeller Foundation operations at the same time. And people like, Crowley's disciples, L. Ron Hubbard, goes and takes it to another level by adding even more coloring to the space operas by creating a UFO cult in 1960 or 59, coming out of his Dianetics work, which is basically just MK Ultra, mind control operations conformed to a self-help manual.
Yeah.
So a lot of this stuff, we're going to go through that in episode 5 of the film that's probably going to come out this summer, if not sooner. I hope sooner.
Well, I love it. I wanted to ask you one more thing. Yeah. I've had hundreds and hundreds of guests who have had or have claimed to have extraterrestrial experiences, very strange paranormal experiences, claim to be involved with magic, with profound results. Could it be that these experiences that people are having are phenomena of consciousness, that it's coming from our own mind, that the mind is such a powerful thing, we are not giving it enough credit as it relates to what it's capable of, and possibly it may be manifesting these situations for people? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I'm totally open to that, and I've had my own experiences too. My wife and I, we've had some interesting anomalous experiences before we started even dating that I can't account for with the language of modern science,
Yeah.
we hadn't seen each other for 2 years, and all of a sudden, I got this flash of a desire to talk to her. And she that same day had been not thinking about me, and all of a sudden she started Googling my name back in 2012 and
Hmm.
just watching some of the classes I had been doing on YouTube. And she had been thinking about me the day before. And I all of a sudden wanted to call her, and I messaged her. So, like after not thinking about each other for 2 years, that happened around the same time. And, there's definitely like modern science has only gone so far, and there's a whole domain of experience, especially when it comes to matters of mind, that we totally have not been able to go there yet, but are definitely happening. I think everybody has different degrees of experience on that. So I wouldn't want to ignore or downplay what's beyond the borderlands.
Yeah.
But the thing is, I think a lot of it is overplayed and
Weaponized as well.
yeah, both weaponized and also like when you take in a lot of the research that I'm like weaving here and talking about,
Mhm.
and you start looking at things like Charles Manson, right?
Mm.
Like Charles Manson family's famous, movies have been made about it, everyone kind of knows, but how many people know that Charles Manson was initiated into Scientology when he was in jail, and he did like 250 hours of
Yeah.
auditing, and he had handlers the whole time. He was also overlapping with the Church of Final Judgment, the
Mm.
Process Church of Final Judgment,
Mm.
that was created by two Scientologists in England in that before coming into New York, New Orleans, Louisiana, and California, which oversaw. I cannot overstate how much of our society, the big bad, the worst of the changes in our current society since 1968 have been affected and influenced by the process Church of Final Judgment. It is
Mm.
ubiquitous in terms of its initiates going off and shaping the R&B movement, what becomes rap, hip hop, a lot of the underlying sects and cults that shape and groom those who are vetted to become influencers within the musical scene, um, as well as Hollywood. I mean, it's crazy. But so Charles Manson, one of his rituals that he had his followers do was called creepy crawly. And people could Google it. The creepy crawly ritual involved breaking into thousands of houses across the United States or the zone around the compounds,
Mm.
and just opening up and looking at people sleeping in bed. And how many people, like, if these guys are part of this whole Scientology complex that's consciously trying to craft new mythologies, new legends, new folklores for the foundation stones of this new religion that they want to create, because no religion can happen without a folklore, without like empirical testimonials. You need to have that in order for the foundation stones of the theory, right? The stories to take hold. How many of these people could put on a mask, inject somebody or put them into a psychedelic state, giving them while they're sleeping, so that they wake up in a bit of a hallucinogenic sort of spin state, and you've got like hobgoblin masks and green masks and other things like dancing over your bed,
Yeah.
or maybe like waking up in the middle of a field after being taken out of your house, which is what a lot of people describe with a pain in the ass, having felt like you've been probed, right?
Mm.
Which is where Jacques Vallée was very correct, I think, in identifying. He does a very masterfully competent breakdown of the similarities of occult ritual, um, of that you'll find in these alien first contact experiences and actual black magical experiences as well. So how many things like that are going on that then create people who then go to authorities, go to the media, tell about what happened to them when they were abducted and found
Yeah.
themselves in a daze in a post hallucinogenic fit, with different uh, schizophrenic qualities in some cases flowing out of that, or feeling like they now have a clairvoyant quality. Maybe something was unlocked while they were getting anally probed on a psychedelic trip, not knowing what happened. Maybe they did have faculties unlocked. I don't know.
Yeah.
And then also like, the cattle mutilations that only began in 1973. Before that, there's no evidence of any cattle mutilations. But then something happens when Operation Phoenix and these these Satanists like Michael Aquino come back from Vietnam, and they're now being deployed after having worked with the Process Church of Final Judgment in the 60s. They go to Vietnam, carry out mass murder of civilians in up to 40, 50,000, and then under Operation Phoenix, and then come back and apply what they learned in the laboratory of Vietnam to the American population. And all of a sudden, there are crop circles showing up. There are cattle mutilations showing up. And I think a lot of that has to do with things that they had practiced in Philippines, in Vietnam, and in Korea, where they were doing things like the Oswald psyops, where they were, kidnapping civilians from villages, killing them, puncturing their wounds, hanging them upside down in the jungles to psych out the guerrillas, the freedom fighting guerrillas who are trying to stop this U.S. military invasion. But they're superstitious. So they see all of these people like upside down. They've got these ancient folk tales of Aswang vampires, and they're like, "Oh shit, it's the bot!" And it's successful at demoralizing and psyching out all of the resistance of these countries that they want to go into. And I think they're. It seems to me that they're using a lot of these techniques and creating again other layers of the narrative that also brings in MK Ultra. Things like Project Stargate, which a lot of the Scientologists are overseeing coming into America. It's high-level Scientologists like Hal Puthoff, who's overseeing, and Ingo Swann, who's overseeing the CIA Stanford Research Institute Project Stargate, that is designed to create super soldiers, basically utilizing trauma-based mind control. A lot of it involves taking Edgar Cayce cults that are part of the Stargate project, that are doing abusive operations on children in camps to help them, create schizophrenic and personality disorders that they think help people channel demons better. Is that true, or is that actually you're just creating broken people who are more, I don't know. And then this becomes the basis of the revolution in military affairs. All of the work that they build up under Stargate in the 70s and the 80s becomes data that they then use to justify why the entire U.S. military needs to be trained in a totally different way by being sent to Esalen to do transcendental meditation and psychedelics and get into orgies and things like that in order to unlock their psychic powers, which then becomes the vanguard of a new Mithraic super soldier reform of the military under the Green Berets in the 80s under Michael Aquino, who's also overseen Operation Phoenix, who's now overseeing this thing, bringing in from PSYOPs to Mind Wars. And that is, part of what becomes Desert Storm. It's part of these very dangerous operatives who carry out 9/11, who do the new age, who unleash the new age of crusades that 9/11 begins. A lot of them actually do want to bring in Gog and Magog. They want to manifest the Book of Revelation. They want to do these things in the same way that the ancient Templars of 1,000 years ago also wanted to bring in this new age by manifesting here on earth what was being written in this very flimsy book of Revelation written by this guy, John, that may not have been written by John at all. It might have been just concocted by high priests and followers of the Sibelian oracles that wanted to create the foundation of religious engineering, which is exactly what Willis Harman, the guy who runs the Stanford Research Institute's, Changing Images of Man project in 1974 with Joseph Campbell. He's literally calling for the creation of religious engineers coming out of the high-level MK Ultra psychiatrists who will shape new religions. And it's tied directly into the thing that becomes the disclosure movement that's being funded by Lawrence Rockefeller, the same guy who's also been bankrolling Terence McKenna, who's bankrolling the careers of Gordon Wassoon.
Wow.
And Albert Hoffman, popularizer of LSD and the Eleusinian Mysteries 2.0. So it's all the same nexus of psychopathic death cultists who have been behind all of these things at the same time. It's all kind of convergent on this singularity thing that they are getting us to believe is coming up, that's pulling us into this moment where the new gods will present themselves, maybe under Christian and Muslim and Indian skin suits, but they're going to be aliens. And we're going to be able to worship them through normalized mass use of sacred drugs, which is what Bobby Kennedy's campaign has been very much in favor of doing, is mass normalizing different types of those drugs that MK Ultra developed in the 50s and 60s. That's what he wants to massively legalize as part of our sacred. He doesn't say that, but I think this is what, Jacques Vallée and others want, is to have this become the new sacred communion, in order to have this idea that we're actually interfacing with these angels and demons, which are the aliens, which we can access through the fifth dimension, opened up, made possible by the psychedelics that they've been, grooming us to. And maybe life is going to be so shit that we're going to be so desperate to want to get the fuck out of reality, and into that type of drugged up state as much as possible, the way Aldous Huxley was kind of calling for in his Brave New World, was the perfect society that would just tune out very easily with Soma. Yeah. So all that stuff, that's where I'm thinking. And I don't want to, again, downplay the real genuine aspects of the powers of mind and spirit as far as something definitely beautiful that does exist. I just think a lot of it's contaminated. A lot of what we talk about is contaminated by this other thing.
100%, man. It's wild. There's so many layers, so much theater, and there's so much more we could get to. So again, I'd love to have you back on, get a little deeper. Before I let you go, remind the audience how they can get a hold of your films, books, all your content.
Sure. Easiest place for the books and the films is canadianpatriot.org, and otherwise risingtidefoundation.net. We host weekly meetings, seminars, things like that for subscribers, and Substack, matthewehret.substack.com. I try to put out things every day, so you can check those 3 things out.
Awesome, man. Well, thank you so much. Definitely have to talk again. And until next time, everyone, have an excellent evening. We'll talk again tomorrow. We'll see y'all then. Hello, friends. I am so excited to tell you about Independent Media Token. Independent Media Token is a brand new way to show your support for independent media without having to donate a dime. Independent Media Token is a cryptocurrency on the Solana blockchain designed to generate funds to promote and foster the growth of independent content creators, allowing them to engage in their art without having to worry about being demonetized. Through a network of media partners, of which you yourself can become a part of, Independent Media Token's goal is to ensure the powers that be can never cut off all of our areas of funding and censor the only free voices left in the world. Join the movement today. You can pick up Independent Media Token using Phantom Wallet or the Solana wallet of your choice, where you can easily swap your Solana for IMT. Grab some IMT today, and remember to always know your team. To learn more, visit independentmediatoken.com or use the link right in the description. If you're looking to start your therapeutic microdosing journey, but don't know where to start, especially when looking for the highest quality ingredients, including nootropics, and what you'd expect from a true microdose capsule, check out our friends at Brainsupreme. They offer the absolute highest quality ingredients so you can start your microdosing journey knowing that you're getting top-notch ingredients. To find out more, visit their website using that link right in the description, and you can get 15% off your entire order. Are you and your family prepared for an emergency? Maybe the fake alien invasion? Now is the time to prepare yourself and your family for any event. Check out Prep Starts Now. Their mission is to provide high-quality preparedness products that empower individuals and families to be ready for any situation. They're committed to delivering reliable, trusted gear to ensure your safety, security, and peace of mind in times of need. Their product selection is carefully curated to provide you with the essential gear you need to stay prepared. From emergency kits to tactical tools, every item is chosen for its reliability and practicality. Prep Starts Now understands the importance of family, and their goal is to equip you with everything you need to build a solid plan for your family's preparedness. In today's ever-changing world, being prepared is more important than ever, and Prep Starts Now is here to help you and your family stay ready with quality products and practical guidance. Use the link in the description and get 15% off your order.